My name is Mano Mohali, and together with Iranti-org, we created a 5-part conversation series about the draft Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill. I sat down with various stakeholders, academics, and activists to discuss and unpack their views about this controversial and contentious bill. The aim of this series is to increase public awareness about the bill, but more importantly, to increase public engagement with the bill. In this interview, I sat down with Dr. Kelly Gillespie from the Department of Anthropology at WITS University. In our chat, Dr. Gillespie emphasized the need to understand hate crimes in their intimate relationship to South Africa's longer history of violence and oppression. She stressed that we have to understand that violence is interconnected, that racism, sexism, and homophobia, for example, support and reinforce each other in upholding a system that privileges certain bodies while criminalizing other bodies. How do you understand hate speech and hate crimes in this post-apartheid moment?
And I think it's important for us always to recognize that we come out of a history of hate. And we have a 400 or so years of very violent colonial and apartheid history that was premised on the foundation, I suppose, that certain people could be dismissed, belittled, and humiliated by others. And that primarily took the language of racism in this country, but it also took the language of sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. So we come out of a historical project of hateful, vicious politicking and social life. For me, the crucial factor in thinking about what a hate crime is now is to understand it and read it in terms of that longer history of hateful human relations that was established in this country. So what I'm interested in really is, and I've done about almost 20 years now of research on the criminal justice system. That's what my research area is. And I'm interested in thinking about how these very particular mechanisms of using the law as a way of remedying that longer history of violence is useful or unuseful, and how we think about that particular technique or technology of legal intervention in relationship to that very long history.
Okay, yeah. So in light of that, and in light of historicizing the current effort to remedy or eradicate the hate crime, knowing that it has such a long and very deep and turbulent history, what do you think the significance of this bill at this moment is, that it arises now in 2016?
I think it predominantly emerges out of that kind of 1960s civil rights movement to try and figure out a way to address social violence. And of course we know we have multiple forms of social violence operating through various vectors: racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, etc. But it's also very important to remember that all of these forms of violence are also connected to each other, and that, as we like to say, all forms of oppression are connected, and that it's very difficult to draw out one strand without also tugging at all of the others that are ongoing. And this folding of longer histories of feminist work, of anti-homophobic work, into the techniques of law, what that begins to do is to move us away from popular consciousness raising, self-defense kind of critiques and movement building into the register of hate crimes legislation, domestic violence acts, right? These techniques which criminalized homophobic, sexist violence rather than led us into the two, right? So very particular things are being criminalized here. And my major concern with the hate crimes legislation, which I'm not a fan of, not only because of that history of the cutting short of those more radical forms of mobilization, but also because the criminalizing of those particular forms of violence tends to draw black men, poor black men, into a racist and classist criminal justice system through processes of criminalization that strengthens forms of racism and classism in ways that I find reprehensible. So we must remember that if we look all the way through to the end of the criminal justice system, we find that generally the men and the women, but predominantly the men that are sent to those prisons are, through the viciousness and violence of those institutions, made into hyper-violent, toxically masculine men that come out with deeper connections to other violent men and systems of violence, and generally come out angry, rageful, and made more toxic by that system. Right? So for me, this is not at all the way that we want to solve the problem of hate.
And how do we kind of fiddle with the restorative justice project that is so tied up with the TRC, that is so tied up with the legacy that the TRC gave us, that has placed a kind of burden on marginalized, oppressed, tired, exhausted people?
Such a good question. It's such a good question. And it's something that I wrestle with. But I think we need to draw a very clear distinction between what restorative justice meant in the TRC, which it was like, let's not criminalize these guys that were responsible for the extreme violences of apartheid. Let's leave them be, right? Yeah. And allow for their truth, their true stories, to stand as the measure by which we can allow them to return into the society. What I'm saying is that if we're going to experiment with restorative justice techniques, at the very least, do it for poor black marginalized people, not for rich white people who are responsible for vicious structural violence, right? And me, I'm someone who thinks that restorative justice doesn't mean you let people off the hook. Restorative justice is work around accountability, but it's just not using violent prisons as a way to do it, right? Or punishment as a criminalization technique. It's saying, how do we work out how to do anti-violence work in order to build the kind of society that we want? So I'm interested in, if we're going to talk about violence, we have to, and the redistribution of violence, we have to talk about how to rework that deeper structure of how violence is done, and how therefore it can be undone in our society.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sitting with me. This has been an immensely discursively rich conversation, and I think one that will push our engagement with this bill a lot further. So thank you.
Thank you for having me on your interview.